Hello, you're very welcome to the Dublin Institute for Advanced Studies here in the heart of Dublin City. Today we're going to explore perceptions of science communication, and we're going to do that through our Improve project, which is an EU-funded ITN, a training network for early stage researchers or PhD candidates. The primary question that we're going to explore is how is the message that we present to the general public or to other disciplinary areas like journalists or artists, how is that message perceived when we project that message as scientists?
What we communicate is determined very much, obviously, by the audience itself. And there's a huge switch between the world of science in which we create papers and we share them in conferences and so on, and people have some kind of vested interest in understanding us. That's why they've gone to the conferences, that they want to expand their knowledge of a field and all of that kind of thing, to the fact that when you're in the world of public engagement, it's a similar situation to being in the world of entertainment. I'm not saying it's the same, but it's similar. And in that world, people only listen to you and only engage with you because they want to. There is no other reason. No one listens to a scientist talking about their science because they have to in this context. And that's incredibly important. And I know it's obvious, but it's one of those obvious things that takes a while for its profound implications to sink in. If you are a research scientist and you are interested in communicating your science, it requires a profound shift of perspective to understand that the only reason anybody will engage with you is because they want to. And it's the world of entertainment that understands this. And so it's a world of knowledge meeting a world of entertainment and seeing what comes out is partly what engagement is all about. Why do we bother to do this? You know, why? I mean, let's think about it. Public engagement, it takes time. You don't have a lot of time. You're busy people. I mean, a lot of you have worry that you don't have enough time to do what your daily demand, the daily demands of your work is. It takes energy. It takes money sometimes. Why do we bother to talk to the general public about our work? Or why is it important to you to do that? In the old days, we used to talk about public understanding of science. This whole public engagement thing used to be called public understanding of science. And it was a very one-way thing. It was like, we scientists who know stuff will tell you, you ignorant public people, all about science, and you'll be grateful and it will be useful to you. And of course, it was realized quite early on that this is incredibly patronizing. And so we use the word engagement, which is very much a two-way thing. One of the key things here is that there are lots of researchers who say, do you know what? Once I started finding ways to engage with the public and talking to them about my team's research, they started saying, well, why don't you look at this? And have you thought about that? And it changed. Many people report that it actually informs and changes the direction of research sometimes. That's incredibly useful. plus the fact that we need to engage with people to know how to speak to them. Sometimes the first time a researcher thinks about this is because they're required to do it. They discover that in order to have a grant, that you need to come up with some kind of public engagement project or show how you are sharing your research more widely. And but if we look at a little bit further, and that's fine, but if we look a little bit further into it, the research that we do is not ours, really. It belongs in part, it is ours, but it belongs in part to the community that funds it. And you know, if we think about those old Frankenstein films, a marvelous, but I think one of the very first talking films was a Frankenstein film, and it's all about being behind, you know, Frankenstein does stuff behind closed doors, really, essentially. Dr. Frankenstein creating his monster. And in that movie, there's thunder and lightning and the rain's pouring down and the villagers come. I mean, how these local villagers produced these academics, I don't know, but they go up to the this place where Frankenstein is working and the lightning is coming down. They bang on the door and demand to see him. And of course, this is classic mad scientists working behind closed doors. And yet, if you need to be funded, you can't be behind closed doors. You know, if you want the public and the public servants, the politicians, very often who are behind these funding decisions, if they are not appreciating and understanding the value of your work, then funding becomes much more difficult. Whether it's fair or not, we know that people who communicate well about their research are more likely to be employed and they're more likely to be funded. I mean, it's not crazy that should be the case. It's probably quite obvious, but it's an important thing when we're thinking about why we do this. Something else, science should be part of culture. It's part of everyday life. We all depend on science. We're just not always aware of it. When we say to most people the word culture, we think of theatre and film and literature and art. We don't tend to think of science, but science is very much part of culture, and the art of science, the art of doing science, should be a part of culture too.
Up first, we have Regina and Maurice from Improve interviewing Sean Duke, a science and technology journalist who's worked with the Irish Times and The Independent, as well as global publications such as the Science magazine. Sean hopes to communicate complex scientific ideas to the general public.
Hi Sean, thanks for coming today and doing this interview with us. Just at the beginning of the interview, could you maybe tell us a little bit about yourself? How were you introduced to a career in journalism and why did you become a journalist?
I didn't really have any introduction to journalism at all. My parents were scientists and I did what they did, and I went to university and studied science. I was interested in writing though, and through kind of an unusual path I went to do a master's then in science communication in New York when it wasn't available here, and I managed to bring my kind of love of science together with my love of writing in science journalism. So it's an area that's developed over the years. When I started, there was very little of it. So I've managed to combine all my interests in one job.
That sounds great. What would an average day in your working life look like?
An average day is spent in the morning typically looking for stories. I'm freelance, I write mainly for the Irish Times, the Irish Independent. So I'm looking for news stories each morning. I have a system set up whereby every paper that's published by a researcher based in Ireland, I can see it on a daily basis. I get ideas from there. I get ideas based on what's happening in the news. I will keep in touch with people. If there's something relevant, I'll get in touch with them to update. And then I will pitch the stories to the editors to see if they're interested, maybe around midday. And then in the afternoon, if they come back to say they want it, I'll end up writing the story then and having it in by about 4 or 5 o'clock.
Okay, so the research or the articles are always from scientists based in Ireland, is that correct?
For the Irish Independent and for the Irish Times, they are most interested in what's happening. They don't have to be Irish scientists, but they have to have some connection with Ireland. It depends on the publication. I write for some American publications, and that's more a global audience. So yeah, for the local papers, if you like to call those the Irish papers, they're local. Yeah, they are interested in Irish-based scientists.
How much time do you actually spend on writing? And if there's also traveling involved or photography in your daily work?
I would spend maybe half my average day writing. About half I would spend like searching for stories, doing research and pitching stories. In terms of travel, I would travel maybe to about 4 or 5 conferences a year. They could be for 3 or 4 days. And in terms of photography, I do some of that and I collect photography myself and I keep it in a file because sometimes there isn't photography that's suitable for a particular story. So it's good to have that on file.
What are the typical steps you do up to a finished publication?
Yes, well, the steps would be you would get your story ideas first from the publications, from looking at the news, from making connections between whether there's a volcano erupting or an earthquake or something in the world. Is there somebody in Ireland I can talk to about that? Then pitching the stories, usually in an email, 3 or 4 story ideas to the different editors that I work with. Then that's in the morning. They will come back hopefully before lunch and say, listen, can you do this one or this one? Maybe 1 or 2 stories. Then I get hold of the scientists, the researchers. I'll interview them. I'll have to write the story quite quickly if it's a news story, have it back into them by maybe 4:30, and that's it.
Okay, cool, thanks.
Which style of article and what sort of scientific content do you think resonates with the general population the most?
I think health is an easy sell in terms of health science because people are interested in their health. There has to be some connection that people can latch on to. So you can't, as a scientist, assume that there's going to be interest. So the rule in journalism is a story is a really good story if it's relevant to a lot of people. So whereas a volcano erupting in New Zealand might be of some interest to people in Ireland, it's of much more interest to people in New Zealand. And that's the way you look at it. You try and look at what is it that's of interest to the readers of this particular publication.
So you mentioned there must be a connection with the people. What sort of connection is that, or what type of connection? Is it an emotional one?
Well, you would have to first of all think, we've got lots of distractions in the world at the moment. We've iPhones, everything, many distractions. So I like to think in terms of myself, would I read this story if I was a reader? Would I actually go to the trouble of reading it? Is there something there that's of interest for me? So you have to sell it to the reader in terms of you need to read this because there is something here for you. Also, if there's something of entertainment value or some kind of background colour or some story that you can keep the reader engaged, great. But there must be some kind of a connection made to the ordinary lives of the reader, relevance.
And maybe building up on that, what are topics that would not catch people's attention or interest at all?
Well, typically ones that are difficult, I suppose, are the high-level physics, some of which is done here in the Dublin Institute for Advanced Studies. But I would argue that there is a way to connect because people are interested in things that are relevant to them, but there's another thing people are interested in, which is learning. So if there's something going on in the world, like cryptocurrency or Bitcoin, that they don't understand, they want to know what it is. They want to be able to learn. So if it's quantum computing, for example, you need to find a way then to make this relevant or make this understandable to the average person. That's not easy, but I would say that it's possible with any any area of science.
Okay, so it's not about the topic necessarily, but more about how it is communicated and if it catches people's attention and
Exactly. You need to find a way to communicate this difficult area in language that the ordinary person understands, which isn't easy, but I would argue you can do it for anything.
Since it can be difficult to reach people's interests, how would you break down scientific context or contents in order to reach as many people as possible?
Well, the most important thing when you're communicating is what you say first, because as I said before, or what you write first. We've got a lot of competing things that are going on looking for attention. So say with an article that's written in a newspaper online, what I do, your lead in, it's called, your first sentence or 2 sentences at the start is critical, because unless you highlight immediately in that first sentence or second sentence what's important, the reader is gone. So there's no point in having something way down the story that's of interest. You have to grab people's attention these days more than ever and hold their attention. So sometimes with scientists, they don't get to the point quickly enough. The key thing is buried. That needs to be put up to the very top and said immediately what's important.
And then as you continue the article, is it possible to go into more detail?
Yes, but I've got a rule about that, that you can go into more detail, say the explanation of the science, but that has to be down the article. Because only maybe 4th, 5th paragraph, you can assume, okay, the reader's probably reasonably interested now, maybe I can try some science. You can never assume that people are going to read. They've lots of other things to do.
Makes sense, yeah. Maybe as to a bit of a different aspect, since there are energy crisis going on, climate change is a huge problem. How do you think that we as researchers have to, change our research in order to, face these issues?
Yeah, I think it is, people do want to hear from experts. And if you've got to the stage where you're doing a PhD, you're an expert. You have to remember that. I think ideally there would be more scientists that would get out there and communicate what they're doing, because it seems like there are only a few scientists that do that and we hear from them a lot. So it would be great if more people did it. I think with climate change, it's tricky because we have a situation here that we all know about. So our brain is primed for something new. So if you see something coming, you say, what's that? Is that something new? But if it's something that you know, it's a bus, then you're not so interested. But if it's something you don't know, then you're looking again. So journalism is like that. And we've heard so much about climate change. We're kind of bored with it. Our brains are kind of bored with it, even though it sounds like a terrible story. This is just my opinion. So I think you need to find different ways to tell that story, maybe looking at a piece of the puzzle rather than the big picture saying we're all in trouble, which we've heard over and over again.
So we have to find new details to sort of catch people's interest, if you like.
Yeah, because I think if you start with the premise that climate change is happening, global warming is happening, it's going to be very bad, people are thinking, I've heard that already. You need to find another way to tell that story. Maybe you are doing something and you start to talk about your research in that area. And then as part of that, it's obvious that this is related to climate change. So you don't need to repeatedly tell people stuff that they already know. Tell them something they don't know. They're more likely to listen or read.
Interesting, because the next question is exactly about that, and you already answered it. But maybe again to emphasize it, so the implications of climate change are often underestimated or even ignored, even though the results from science are actually very well known. So do you think that science communication fails at this point, and how could science be communicated more efficiently?
Yeah, as I mentioned there, I think part of this is not science communication failing, but it's human psychology. That if we hear of a new threat, we're on alert. But if we hear of a threat and we hear it repeatedly, we kind of switch off if it hasn't happened. So we haven't seen a tidal wave covering Dublin, so people start to relax. How do you more effectively communicate it? I think, as I said before, maybe focusing on little areas where you're studying that are relevant, obviously, when you hear the story to climate change, but you don't need to continually make the point that we all know that there is a big problem here.
What do you think about social media? Would you say that the increasing popularity of it has a positive or rather a negative effect on science communication?
I would say generally that it's positive, because I have, particularly what I do, I've noticed I've more access to more stuff going on. So when I'm on Twitter, that's another place that I should have mentioned where I can get stories. I'm on there and it's fascinating. It's like a conversation between scientists. We know there's a downside to social media, but there's definitely an upside. And with scientists talking to each other, or raising issues, or putting up their papers, sometimes you see absolute fantastic stories that are in there. It's like you're listening into a conversation. So I think that social media has been beneficial. Sometimes it's not. I know, for example, that there's a lady who does work in scientific fraud, for example, and she exposes people who've changed their papers or put in images that they shouldn't have into papers, stuff like this, which is more common than you would think. She gets quite a lot of abuse on social media from different people. So that's not good, because that's anti-democratic. So it's a medium. It's got positives and negatives.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
And now we have Regina and Maurice interviewing Siobhan MacDonald. Siobhan is an artist who works with the general public to see how they perceive science and art. Siobhan is an artist in residence at Studiotopia and an artist in resident at Trinity College Dublin. She's won several awards, including the Ocean Memory Award and the Island Arts Project Award.
Okay, hello. Thanks for coming today and thanks for doing the interview with us. Maybe at the beginning of the interview, could you just talk a little bit about yourself? How were you introduced to Korean arts and why did you become an artist?
Well, that's a really good question. I always wanted to be an artist from my very first memory. It was just something that I was driven to do, and I guess I was always very curious as a child and was really into the natural world and liked to play and explore. So I spent my whole school years just wanting to draw and paint, and I just naturally morphed towards art college, and they let me in.
Your art addresses a lot of natural phenomena and you work a lot with natural materials. How do you find your motives for your artwork?
It's, you know, there's so many different ways. I guess I live and breathe art all the time. It's what I see the world in a particular way, and I download information everywhere I go, and the motives, I don't go searching for them, they just become themselves. And very often I'll find an object or something that's broken or something that's really amazing in an antique shop, and it will sit in my studio for a long time and I won't know why, apart from the fact that I'm attracted to it. Or maybe I'll read something in a newspaper that sort of I'll cut out and stick on the wall, and it sort of imprints itself on my psyche, and then sometimes months or years later it starts to make sense why it's there. So I piece them together, and so it's something I like to put things together. So if it's something that I found and then something I've discovered, and then so a conversation can start between the two objects, and it takes off from there.
Okay, maybe some of your specific work to look into that. Recently you said you placed hydrophones in the Greenland Ocean, and the question would be, what motivates you to work with sound?
Yeah, I'm just back from an expedition in Greenland, fascinating trip on a boat with oceanographers, and we spent a month traveling through. It's a really important part of the ocean, which is very near the Greenland ice cap, which is the most topical place in the world for looking at ecosystems and how the planet is adapting. And I want, well, part of what I'm doing is working with sound, because when you're there and you're kind of on a boat for a month, you become so attuned to things like light, and sound is so powerful. I also my room was in the base, like down low in the boat. So, and I'd written a proposal to become an ocean, called Become an Ocean, and there was a lot. It was a very stormy time, and the boat was moving a lot. So I was really aware of the magnitude of the water and the rhythm of the water and the storm and the movement. So sound became the vocabulary in which I started to draw, and the presence of this ever omnipresent body of water just talked to me through sound. And also I lay a lot on the floor of where my bedroom was, and because the boat was moving so much, it was the safest place to be. But I could hear the whales, and I could hear the water. So, but I've worked a lot with sound for years. In fact, Professor Chris Bean, who is, I think, probably working with both of you, he and I have spent many years talking about sound waves, and he's taught me a lot. In fact, the Dublin Institute of Advanced Studies this summer, I have come to talk about sound for over a decade, and so everything from volcanic infrasound waves to seismic waves to how animals can hear below certain hertz and we can't, it all influences my paintings and how I see the world. So yeah, it's I could talk about that all day.
So following up on that, how has any collaboration with Chris Bean, for example, or any other scientific institute has influenced your artwork?
Very much so. I've spent a long time collaborating with Chris over many years, and various different institutions, from European Commission, the scientists there, and NASA and European Space Agency, to Trinity College. So the conversations have been very wide and very deep, and influenced me greatly, because I often think that if science is the magic, then art is the soul, you know, and the places where our two disciplines kind of talk to each other, it's very resonant with me. I've just come off a 2-year residency with Chris, actually, where we worked with European institutions on this idea of art and science, and we turned it upside down. So it wasn't like, it was more about how does the art influence the science as opposed to the other way around. So we explored it, and in many different guises, and made a body of work that's been exhibited across Europe just recently. And to answer your question, I think it's one conversation, really. I mean, artists and scientists are both explorers and seeking knowledge. But for me, it's about where I get an opportunity to disrupt the norm, and to look at things from a totally different lens or different point of view. And I can do that as an artist. Chris can't do that as a scientist. So there's a wonderful dance and nuance that can go on between both things, because the one thing I'll say about the discipline of science is that it's output related. There's always an output, but with art there isn't, which is always when the best work happens. So when an artist and a scientist comes together and it's a project, it needs a lot of time, and it needs time to gestate and allow for there to be no output, and to allow for even to go into the void where those, like, knowledge is created. So you're trying to create something absolutely new. You have to go to the empty space.
Okay, cool.
So maybe building up on that, so we as scientists, we have to present our results, such in the form of graphics or publications, and it's really crucial how we do that. So you use very different forms to present your work: film, paintings, sound. How do you decide on which presentation format to use, and what matters to you most when making that decision?
I tend to not make decisions in a literal way. I feel my way into things. I spend a lot of time in the studio where I try to empty my mind of the conversations and empty my mind of knowledge and information. There's a different process. There's a time for research, and then there's a time for me for making. And I can't do the two at the same time. If I enter into a creation space with a lot of noise, the work just can't come out. It gets blocked. So I tend to kind of, create from a place of the other side of the brain, you know. So it's where the intuition is, and where I can sort of follow my feelings into it. And when I'm making color, I tend to not even look at a color. I try to sense it from a different point of view. So I use the senses to get there. So I think with science, that like the really obvious difference is that you present knowledge in forms where you present it where it's actually a report, or it's something that you've proven and getting ready to disprove at some point. But what I do is nothing to do with that whatsoever. But when the two are put together, not where the art is explaining the science, that would be absolutely something I'm not interested in, but when they can talk to each other in some way on the same subject, magic can happen.
Do you think about a specific audience when you create, let's say? So, or does it not matter at all, the audience?
Well, it always matters, but if you start to think about questions like that before you're making work, you're sort of putting the cart before the horse.
Yeah.
I think the work has to be a fully energetic thing in and of itself, and then it creates its own audience. So it's always going back to the initial thing, as opposed to thinking my way through, which I do in a different sort of a way, but I have to feel my way through. So it's like if you were confronted by, in front of a glacier, and you want to read about it and know about it and look at a graph to understand how it's, melting or how it's receded. To start, there's one way you can take that information in intellectually and through your mind. But when you're standing in the presence of the magnitude of these archives of history and this enormity, and it's cold, and you're standing there, and it took ages to get there, and you feel it and you see it in the beauty and the sublime landscape, you have a completely different response to this, to the idea that this landscape is in danger. So if if you imagine those two different examples, it's like as if you walk into, there's so many different ways of thinking about how powerful the senses are, which is, I think, something that science doesn't have sometimes, or doesn't get a chance to explore. Like if you walk in somewhere and you hear a piece of music that you have maybe never heard before, or you heard as a child, and you are instantly brought to your knees, and you just think, it just can hit you like nothing else can. Or a smell, of something that you haven't smelt for a long, long time, and it can just it can go straight to that part of your brain where it accesses a portal of memory that can bring you back to being 5 years old, smelling your mother's, scones or whatever. So those are the kinds of sensorial palette that I work with. And I think that, so I hope that helps to explain.
Yeah, thank you. Do you think that scientists sometimes lack this ability to use their senses? Do you think this more emotional approach would sometimes be also helpful in science, where we usually use a very analytical, brain-focused approach?
Definitely, I think it would require, though, an entire rewriting of how science is studied, and how how it is disseminated. And I don't know if there's the space to do that in the time that you have to output and prove and disprove. It's part of the whole way that it's become itself. I think maybe the idea of working with scientists and opening that portal wider and making it more available, then I think that's really powerful, because then but one thing I do think, and I've worked with many different scientists, and most of them, thank God, are really incredible and really expressive. They are in themselves, usually musicians and closet painters. So they instantly are right in there in the conversation, and just can't wait to basically take off the science hat and take the boundary, tick the box of emptying the boundaries. But sometimes I've come across some scientists who are very, very rigid in their thinking, because of the training they've had, and they just want to stick to the box. And God forbid, you could mention something really sort of outside of the remit of what they've studied, it really makes them feel very insecure, and all the shutters go down. So I can't work in that way at all. But people like Chris and many other people I've met are just right in there and just so free in themselves.
But since you were mentioning that box that scientists like to stick to, do you think that, for example, with regard to climate change, that science could communicate this issue better than it is communicated if you wouldn't stick to that box?
Could communicate it better. Yeah, I think a lot of the language that is used when I pick up nature geoscience and some of the graphs that I look at, they kind of push me out. It takes me. I have to really slow myself down in order to kind of find my way in. Or I talk to one of my scientists friends who help me to see through it, to understand the language. Yeah, I do for sure. Like, I mean, look at what's happening to the Earth right now, and I mean, COP27 alone describing, you know, where we've arrived at. It's gonzo at this point, and a lot of the scientists in Cambridge were talking about, like, why are we still having this conversation? Why are we still drawing these graphs? Like, we need an entirely different way to, you know, address this situation. So I think it is very far behind. Yeah.
Maybe to follow up on that, do you think science could benefit from art, making use of it to address this issue?
Definitely, but as long as the scientists or it's set up in a way where the science or the science people who want to access, you know, art in order to create an emotive response understand how art works, because art is not there to make a graph or to make some sort of pictorial evidence of their research at all. You know, it's not. Our art has its own energy system and a completely different, you know, hymn sheet. It's got a completely different set of notes. So when the two can work in tandem and each can create something that is an energy system within and of itself that has a power to it, then yes, but not yeah, you know what I mean.
Yeah,
I hope so.
Yeah. It does make sense. Yeah.
Yeah, I think a lot of sometimes there's this kind of belief system that art is there to explain science, and that's so far behind. It's such old thinking. Yeah.
Okay. Yep.
What do you think is our responsibility as Earth scientists in terms of how we do research and to ensure that research we do is communicated efficiently?
What do I think is the responsibility of a scientist?
Yes, in terms of how we approach our research, how we do research.
I think to keep an open mind, to constantly listen to music, to constantly challenge that part of yourself that wishes to push it into an analytical sense, to constantly look at the big picture and ask yourself questions about, like, what are you trying to do? Where are you coming from within yourself? And to realize that you are a human being living in this energy system and everything's connected. So to get lost in, and to constantly challenge it, to push it, to seek new forms of knowledge, to read philosophy, to read poetry, to look at art. I think that would really help to keep your spirit alive.
Do you think that science that does not have any benefit for people because the science exists, do you think it's justifiable?
Pardon?
That science that is just done in order to gain more knowledge, but that not directly helps people, for example, or that is not done for people, so to say. Do you think it's justifiable?
Yeah, I mean, it depends on what it is. It depends on what it is. I mean, somebody who discovered the sunspots on the sun was a Carrington in the 1800s. I think he was he was just trying to see what was happening on the sun. He wasn't thinking about the audience. You know, he discovered something really important, and there was only room for that at that time. So you have to, I guess, keep it all in proportion.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think, yeah, movement is really important as well, to constantly, I'm going back to your last question, not just sound and challenge yourself, but to kind of just be in your body, to be relaxed in your body, and to do lots of alternative things and get yourself out of your head.
Yeah, maybe at this point, an interesting question. Did you ever consider becoming a scientist?
They wouldn't have me.
Okay.
No, I didn't. I thought at one point I wanted to be a geologist, because I spent my childhood digging through the forests in County Monaghan, where I'm from, and finding rocks and examining them and all of this. And I thought, this means I want to be a geologist. And then I realized that I would have to record it as opposed to draw it. I thought, no, forget it. I want to work with the soul of this rock, not the information of it, you know? So that was a very clear answer for me at the time. No, I don't think I'd like to be a scientist, no, but I love the magic of it.
Of disaster, and Pompeii, and then I guess stone, because it turns into stone afterwards.
Like heat or the Canary Islands.
For me, I just started reading the book Pompeii yesterday, so that just came to my mind. Yeah, just like islands. I don't know.
Magma.
Yeah. Dangerous. I don't know. Yeah.
Okay. Wait. Yeah, I think the biggest one I've ever heard of was like in Hawaii when I was younger. So Hawaii.
Yeah, for me it's directly something like also danger or many deaths as well. I don't know.
So maybe a threat.
A threat, yes.
Canary Islands.
Lava.
Lava.
Oh, it's pretty shaky.
Cracks.
Waves.
Cave.
Mud.
Good in Iceland, yeah.
Free energy.
Oh, okay, sure, yeah, makes sense.
Warm.
Heating.
Octopus, because I think octopi perceive things differently to humans. I've heard that that might be rubbish. And then I guess humans, because humans perceive things in a linear fashion, but we don't really understand how other animals, quite yet, how other animals perceive reality. So.
Maths. Maybe the Dublin bus system.
That would be something that's non-predictable and can follow chaotic patterns.
Thank you for watching this digital training module by DIAS. We really enjoyed filming it, and we hope it will help you with your PhD studies in the future.